It started as just another routine stop, but what happened next would change everything. A seasoned black colonel, Lieutenant Colonel Vanessa Carter, 52, respected for her service and poise, found herself face to face with a cop whose prejudices were impossible to ignore. His tone was sharp, his words laced with assumptions, and his demeanor screamed authority unchecked. But this wasn't just any ordinary citizen he had pulled over. What he didn't realize was that he was dealing with someone who had faced tougher battles than his condescending attitude. The colonel handled the situation in a way that left him stunned. With every word she spoke, she unraveled his biases and forced him to confront his actions in a way he never saw coming. By the end, she didn't just stand her ground. She changed the narrative entirely. What did she do that left him speechless? Stay tuned to find out. As the officer stood towering over her window, his questions were less about the reason for the stop and more about her identity. "Where are you headed?" he asked, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. Colonel Carter, dressed in civilian clothes, remained composed. She had seen this kind of treatment before and wasn't one to back down. Instead of answering right away, she asked calmly, "Is there a reason you pulled me over, officer?" Her voice carried the authority of someone who had led troops, faced pressure, and navigated situations far more intense than this roadside encounter. But the officer wasn't ready to let go of his assumptions. He pressed further, his words becoming more pointed. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the woman sitting before him wasn't just anyone. She had a story, a legacy, and a presence that would soon turn this encounter into something unforgettable. The officer's tone grew sharper. "License and registration?" he demanded, barely hiding his irritation. Colonel Carter calmly handed him the documents, her movements steady and deliberate. As he glanced at her license, his demeanor changed slightly, but the skepticism in his eyes remained. He was looking for something, anything, to justify his behavior. "What brings you through this area?" he asked, his voice laced with a thinly veiled challenge. The colonel took a breath, carefully choosing her words. "I'm on my way to meet someone," she replied, her tone still firm yet respectful. But behind her calm exterior, she was piecing together exactly how to handle this situation. She knew this wasn't just about a routine stop. It was about power, prejudice, and how one chose to respond. Meanwhile, a small crowd of onlookers began to gather at a distance, their curious gazes adding an unexpected layer of tension. The officer noticed too, but didn't let up, doubling down on his questioning. What he didn't realize was that every word he spoke and every action he took was leading to a moment he wouldn't forget. The officer took a step back, scanning the colonel's car as though searching for something to justify his behavior. His questions grew more intrusive, his tone more condescending. "Are you sure this vehicle is registered to you?" he asked, holding her registration with a raised eyebrow. The colonel didn't flinch. "It is," she replied firmly. She had nothing to prove, but she knew the importance of staying calm in moments like these. She wasn't just defending herself, she was setting an example. The tension in the air was almost palpable. The small crowd that had gathered whispered among themselves, some recording the interaction with their phones. The officer glanced toward them, his confidence wavering for just a moment before he turned back to her. "I need you to step out of the car," he finally said, his voice firm but uneasy. The colonel's eyes met his, steady and unyielding. Without hesitation, she opened the door and stepped out, standing tall. Her quiet strength seemed to catch him off guard. She didn't raise her voice or argue. She didn't need to. Her very presence spoke volumes. The crowd leaned in closer, sensing that something important was about to happen. And in that moment, the officer began to realize he was no longer in control of the narrative. As Colonel Carter stood outside her car, her presence seemed to shift the dynamic entirely. The officer's confidence faltered for a split second, but he masked it with a sharp command. "Hands where I can see them," he said, though she had made no sudden movements. She complied, her expression calm but unyielding, her gaze steady. The murmur from the crowd grew louder, the tension thick in the air. Then, without warning, another car pulled up. A senior officer stepped out, his uniform immaculate, his demeanor authoritative. He scanned the scene quickly, his eyes landing on the colonel. For a moment, there was silence as recognition flashed across his face. "Colonel, "Is everything all right here?" he asked, his voice respectful. The younger officer stiffened, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm. He quickly realized the woman he had been interrogating wasn't just anyone, but instead of stepping back, he doubled down. "She was acting suspiciously," he blurted, his tone defensive. The senior officer's expression darkened slightly, but he remained calm. "Suspicious? Do you have evidence? Or were we making assumptions here?" The crowd grew quiet, sensing the shift in power. The colonel didn't say a word, allowing the moment to unfold. The younger officer was now visibly uneasy, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. And just when it seemed like the tension couldn't get any higher, the colonel finally spoke. Words that would leave everyone stunned. She complied, her expression calm but unyielding, her gaze steady. The murmur from the crowd grew louder, the tension thick in the air. Then, without warning, another car pulled up. A senior officer stepped out, his uniform immaculate, his demeanor authoritative. He scanned the scene quickly, his eyes landing on the colonel. For a moment, there was silence as recognition flashed across his face. "Colonel, is everything all right here?" he asked, his voice respectful. The younger officer stiffened, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm. He quickly realized the woman he had been interrogating wasn't just anyone, but instead of stepping back, he doubled down. "She was acting suspiciously," he blurted, his tone defensive. The senior officer's expression darkened slightly, but he remained calm. "Suspicious? Do you have evidence? Or were we making assumptions here?" The crowd grew quiet, sensing the shift in power. The colonel didn't say a word, allowing the moment to unfold. The younger officer was now visibly uneasy, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. And just when it seemed like the tension couldn't get any higher, the colonel finally spoke. Words that would leave everyone stunned. The colonel turned to the younger officer, her voice calm yet commanding. "Officer, do you know who I am?" she asked, her question echoing in the tense silence. The younger man hesitated, clearly unsure how to respond. The senior officer stepped forward, his tone firm but composed. "This is Colonel Vanessa Carter, a decorated veteran and someone who has served this country with honor for over 2 decades. The crowd gasped softly, the weight of the revelation hitting everyone at once. The younger officer's face turned pale as he realized the gravity of his actions. He stammered, attempting to explain himself, but the colonel raised her hand, silencing him. "This isn't about me," she said firmly. "It's about how you treat people, anyone, regardless of rank, uniform, or background." The senior officer nodded, his expression serious. "Colonel, I apologize on behalf of this department. This behavior is unacceptable." The younger officer, now visibly shaken, muttered an apology. But the colonel wasn't done. She stepped closer, her voice steady and resolute. "Use this moment to reflect, to do better, because next time, it might not be someone with a title you recognize." As the senior officer led the younger one aside for a stern conversation, the colonel turned to the crowd, offering a small but knowing nod before calmly getting back into her car. The onlookers were silent for a moment before someone started clapping, the sound spreading through the group. As she drove away, the colonel's phone buzzed. A message appeared from an unknown number. "Thank you for what you did today. You're changing more than one life." She glanced at the screen, a small smile tugging at her lips. Even in moments of conflict, the ripples of her actions reached further than she could ever imagine. As the colonel drove away, the tension of the encounter began to fade, replaced by a quiet sense of accomplishment. She knew moments like these weren't about dramatic victories or proving someone wrong. They were about planting seeds of change. The younger officer had been humbled, and the senior officer's intervention had shown the importance of accountability. The colonel reflected on the faces in the crowd, particularly a young boy standing with his mother, watching closely. She hoped he had seen more than just the conflict, that he had witnessed the power of staying calm, standing firm, and commanding respect without anger. By the time she reached her destination, the colonel felt a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't about the titles or the recognition. It was about using her voice and actions to pave a better path for those who came after her. And today, she had done exactly that.